My grandfather was part of a classified mission in 1991. The government paid him to never speak about it. Last week, the payments stopped. My grandfather Raymond died 3 days ago. The official cause was heart failure, which made sense given he was 81 and had been chain-smoking unfiltered cigarettes since before I was born. What didn't make sense was the timing, or the phone call I got from his bank 2 hours before he died, asking why the automatic deposits that had been coming in monthly for 32 years had suddenly stopped. I didn't even know about any deposits. Raymond had worked as a plumber his whole life, retired at 65 with a modest pension, lived in the same small house in Ohio that he'd bought in the 70s. There was no reason for mysterious payments, and definitely no reason for them to stop right before he died. I drove to his house the day after he passed, ostensibly to start going through his things before my mother and her sisters descended to fight over whatever was left. The place smelled like stale tobacco and old coffee, exactly how I remembered it from childhood visits. Everything looked the same, down to the ancient television in the living room and the stack of crossword puzzle books on the side table. But there was something different about the air itself, a heaviness that hadn't been there before, like the house knew its owner was gone and was holding its breath. I started in his bedroom, going through drawers full of old clothes and papers, tax returns, utility bills, nothing interesting. Then I found a metal lockbox shoved way back in his closet, buried under a pile of winter coats he probably hadn't worn in a decade. It was heavy, secured with a combination lock that looked military grade. I tried his birthday, my grandmother's birthday, every date I could think of. Nothing worked. I was about to give up when I noticed a piece of masking tape on the bottom of the box with 4 numbers written in faded ink. 1991. The year on the box, the year in the title of this story. My hands were shaking as I spun the dial. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside were things that made no sense for a retired plumber to own. A stack of documents with heavy black redactions covering most of the text. Photographs of Raymond in military gear I'd never seen him wear, standing in what looked like a desert with mountains in the background. A laminated ID card with his photo and the words Defense Intelligence Agency printed across the top, and a letter, dated January 15, 1991, signed by someone whose name had been blacked out, thanking Raymond for his service and confirming the terms of his compensation agreement. The letter mentioned a mission designated as Operation Sandglass, and stated that in exchange for Raymond's participation and subsequent silence, he would receive monthly payments of $3,000 for the rest of his natural life, adjusted annually for inflation. The payments would cease immediately upon his death, or if he violated the non-disclosure agreement by discussing any aspect of the operation with any person not authorized to receive such information. Violation would result in immediate termination of benefits and potential criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act. I read the letter 3 times, each time hoping it would start making sense. My grandfather had been a plumber. He'd fixed sinks and toilets, told bad jokes, watched baseball games. He'd never been in the military as far as I knew, never mentioned anything about intelligence work or classified missions. But here was proof, right in my hands, that his entire life had been built on a lie. Or maybe not a lie, but a carefully constructed cover story that everyone, including his own family, had believed for over 3 decades. The photographs showed a different man than the one I'd known. Younger, obviously, but also harder somehow, with an expression in his eyes that suggested he'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. I spread everything out on his bed and took photos with my phone, some instinct telling me I needed to document this before someone came and took it all away. There were more pictures in the box, showing Raymond with other men in similar gear, all of them posed in front of various vehicles and buildings. One photo showed what looked like an enormous hole in the ground, perfectly circular, with Raymond and 2 others standing at the edge staring down into it. The back of the photo had a date written in pencil, March 3, 1991. Another showed the interior of what appeared to be a cave or tunnel, the walls smooth and almost metallic looking, reflecting the camera flash in weird ways. In that one, Raymond was pointing at something on the wall, though the photo was too dark to make out what it was. The documents were frustrating because so much had been redacted. I could make out fragments like unidentified structure, anomalous readings, containment failure, and civilian casualties prevented. One page was almost entirely blacked out, except for a single sentence at the bottom. All personnel are reminded that disclosure of any information regarding Site J will result in immediate and permanent consequences. I was so focused on the papers that I didn't hear my mother come in. She called my name from downstairs, and I nearly jumped out of my skin, scrambling to shove everything back into the lockbox. But she was already climbing the stairs, asking if I'd found anything interesting. I met her in the hallway, positioned between her and the bedroom, and told her I was just going through old clothes. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying, and guilt washed over me for hiding this from her. But something in my gut told me she shouldn't see what I'd found. Not yet. Not until I understood what it meant. She said she was going to start on the kitchen. Did I want help with the bedroom? I told her I had it under control. Maybe she could tackle the garage instead. She agreed and headed back downstairs. I locked the bedroom door and returned to the box, my heart pounding. There was one more item I hadn't examined yet. A small notebook with a cracked leather cover. I opened it carefully, expecting more mission details or coordinates or something equally cryptic. Instead, I found what appeared to be a journal, written in Raymond's distinctive scrawled handwriting. The first entry was dated February 20th, 1991. They told us it would be routine reconnaissance, that we'd be in and out in 72 hours. They didn't tell us what we'd be looking for until we were already on the ground in Iraq, 50 miles west of Baghdad, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Coalition forces were pushing toward the capital, and we were supposed to investigate some kind of anomaly that satellite imagery had picked up 3 weeks earlier. A structure that shouldn't exist, appearing overnight in a location that had been empty desert the day before. Command was concerned it might be a new weapons facility, something unconventional that Saddam's people had managed to keep hidden. They assembled a small team, 6 of us total, all with different specializations. I was brought in because of my engineering background, my ability to assess structural integrity and identify potential hazards. The others were intelligence analysts, a linguist, a geologist, and a medic. None of us knew each other before we got on that transport plane. The entry continued for several pages, describing their arrival at a forward operating base, the briefing they received, the helicopter ride out to the site. Raymond wrote about the heat, the constant wind blowing sand into every crevice, the tension among the team as they approached their destination. Then the entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted. The next entry was dated March 1st, 1991, 9 days later. I don't know how to describe what we found. Even now, sitting in the debriefing room while they decide what to do with us, I'm not sure I believe my own memories. But it happened. All 6 of us saw it, recorded it, documented it. They can't make us unsee what we saw. The structure was exactly where the satellite had indicated, rising out of the sand like some kind of monument. But it wasn't built, not in any conventional sense. It looked grown, or formed, like it had been extruded from the earth itself. Perfectly smooth black material that none of us could identify. No seams, no joints, no evidence of construction. Just this seamless obsidian tower about 40 feet tall and maybe 15 feet in diameter, standing alone in the desert with nothing around it for miles. We approached it carefully, expecting an ambush or a trap. But there was nothing. Just the tower and the wind and this strange humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Collins, our geologist, took samples of the material, but his drill bits couldn't make a dent. Whatever it was made of, it was harder than anything he'd encountered before. That's when Porter found the entrance. I stopped reading and checked my phone. My mother was still clattering around in the garage, oblivious to what I'd discovered. I wanted to call someone, to share this insanity with another person so I wouldn't feel like I was losing my mind. But who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I was holding the evidence in my hands. I kept reading. The entrance wasn't visible from the outside, but Porter noticed that the humming got louder when he stood on the south side of the tower. He pressed his hand against the surface, and a doorway just appeared, a perfect rectangular opening that definitely hadn't been there seconds before. We all saw it happen. One moment solid wall, the next moment an entrance into darkness. Command wanted us to wait for additional support before entering, but we were already there, and God knows when reinforcements would arrive. We'd been authorized to investigate, and that's what we intended to do. I volunteered to go in first, because I was the most experienced with structural assessment and could hopefully identify any obvious dangers. I strapped on my headlamp, checked my sidearm, and stepped through the opening. The others followed close behind, their lights bobbing in the darkness. Inside was nothing like what we expected. The exterior suggested a hollow tower, but the interior opened into something massive, a space that couldn't possibly fit inside the structure we'd seen from outside. It was like stepping into a cathedral, except the walls were that same black material, and they curved in ways that hurt to look at, angles that didn't make geometric sense. The journal entry went on for pages, describing their exploration of the interior space. Raymond wrote about finding rooms that seemed to shift when they weren't looking directly at them, corridors that led back to places they'd already been, even though they'd only walked straight ahead, doorways that opened onto impossible vistas. At one point, they'd looked through a window and seen what appeared to be an ocean, waves crashing against rocks, even though they were in the middle of the Iraqi desert. Collins tried to take readings with his equipment, but everything malfunctioned the moment they crossed the threshold. Compasses spun wildly, GPS units showed locations on different continents. Radiation detectors maxed out, and then went completely dead. The medic, a woman named Teresa Vaughn, started experiencing nosebleeds and dizziness. Porter, the one who'd found the entrance, began hearing voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. They decided to retreat, to get back outside and regroup, but when they turned around, the entrance was gone. Just smooth black wall where the doorway had been. They were trapped inside with no way out and no way to communicate with the outside world. Raymond's handwriting became more frantic as the entry continued. We spent what felt like hours searching for an exit, but time didn't work right in there. My watch kept jumping forward and backward, sometimes running normally and sometimes completely stopped. Porter said his showed that we'd only been inside for 10 minutes, but I know it had been much longer. At some point, we found another room, larger than the others, with something in the center that I still can't adequately describe. It looked like a machine, but also organic, like a hybrid of technology and living tissue. It was pulsing with light, different colors I'd never seen before, colors that don't exist in normal spectrum. And it was making that humming sound we'd heard outside, except much louder now, vibrating through our bones. Collins approached it, fascinated, and reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, everything changed. The next few pages were nearly illegible, Raymond's handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls. I could make out fragments about Collins screaming, about the walls starting to move, about Porter's face melting and reforming into something else, about Teresa disappearing entirely, there one moment and gone the next, like she'd been edited out of existence, about the other two team members, whose names Raymond never mentioned, doing things to each other that made no sense, their bodies bending in ways bodies shouldn't bend, and through it all, that humming sound getting louder and louder until it felt like the inside of their skulls would crack open. Then, abruptly, they were outside again, standing in the sand beside the tower as if they'd never entered. But it had been 3 days. 3 full days had passed while they'd been inside, though it had felt like only a few hours. And Collins was gone. He wasn't with them when they emerged, and when they tried to go back in to find him, the entrance wouldn't open. The tower had sealed itself, become solid again, no trace of the doorway they'd used. They called for extraction and spent the next 6 hours sitting in the sand, waiting for the helicopter, not talking about what they'd seen because putting it into words felt dangerous. I set the journal down and rubbed my eyes, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become. This was insane. This had to be fiction. Some weird creative writing project my grandfather had worked on. Except it matched the dates on the official documents, matched the photographs, matched the letter about the payments. And Raymond had never been creative, never told stories or wrote fiction. He'd been practical, grounded, the kind of man who dealt with concrete problems that had concrete solutions. Reading about him experiencing something so impossible felt fundamentally wrong, like finding out your accountant secretly believed in ghosts. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking if I wanted lunch. I told her I wasn't hungry, that I'd be done with the bedroom soon. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji, and I went back to the journal. The entries after the mission were shorter, more sporadic. Raymond wrote about being held in isolation for 2 weeks, while government officials questioned him repeatedly about every detail of what happened. They showed him photographs of the interior he didn't remember taking, footage from cameras he didn't remember wearing. They asked about Collins over and over, wanted to know exactly where he'd gone, what he'd touched, what he'd said. Raymond didn't have answers. Collins was just gone, vanished inside that structure, and none of them knew how to get him back. Eventually, they were released with the non-disclosure agreement and the promise of monthly payments. Raymond wrote about struggling to readjust to normal life, about taking the plumbing job because working with pipes and water felt real and solid in a way that nothing else did anymore. He wrote about meeting my grandmother 6 months later, about marrying her without ever telling her what had happened in Iraq, about having my mother, about building a life that looked completely ordinary from the outside while carrying this secret that ate at him every single day. There was an entry from 1995 where he mentioned seeing Porter at a gas station in Kentucky, hundreds of miles from where either of them lived. Porter had looked at him with empty eyes and walked away without saying a word. Another entry from 2003 described waking up at 3 in the morning to find Teresa Vaughn standing in his bedroom, looking exactly as she had the last time he'd seen her in 1991, not aged a day. She'd stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and then vanished, leaving behind a smell like ozone and burnt plastic. Raymond stopped writing in the journal after that, or at least this journal. Maybe there were others hidden somewhere in the house. The last entry was dated November 2003 and consisted of a single sentence. I saw the tower again today, but it was in my backyard instead of Iraq, and I think it wants me to come back inside. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice the sound at first. A low humming, barely audible, that seemed to be coming from somewhere below me. I looked up from the journal and realized the bedroom had gotten darker, even though it was only early afternoon, and the sun had been shining through the windows moments ago. The humming got louder, and with it came a smell I couldn't identify, something sharp and acidic that made my eyes water. I stood up, suddenly afraid, and that's when I noticed the window. There was someone standing outside, looking in at me, but that was impossible because Raymond's bedroom was on the second floor, and there was nothing outside but a small roof overhang and a 15-foot drop to the lawn below. The figure was tall, inhumanly tall, with proportions that looked wrong even through the glass. I couldn't make out details of its face because the sunlight behind it created a silhouette, but I could see it was watching me, its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. The humming intensified, and I realized it was coming from the figure, resonating through the window and into the room. I backed away slowly, the lockbox and journal clutched against my chest, never taking my eyes off the thing outside. It pressed one hand against the glass, and I saw its fingers were too long, each one segmented in too many places. The window began to frost over where it touched, ice crystals spreading across the pane in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. My mother's voice called up the stairs again, asking if I was okay, if I'd heard that weird noise. The sound of her voice seemed to break whatever spell had been cast, and I blinked, and the figure was gone. Just empty air beyond the window, bright sunshine, normal afternoon. The humming had stopped. The smell had vanished. I was standing in the middle of Raymond's bedroom, hyperventilating, while my mother climbed the stairs to check on me. I shoved the lockbox under the bed and met her in the hallway, trying to look casual even though I was drenched in cold sweat. She asked what was wrong, and I told her I'd just gotten emotional going through Raymond's things, thinking about him being gone. She hugged me and said she understood, that it was hitting her too. We stood there for a moment, and then she went back downstairs, satisfied that I was okay. I wasn't okay. I went to the window and examined the glass carefully. There was nothing unusual about it, no frost, no marks, no evidence that anything had been standing outside, but I knew what I'd seen. Just like Raymond had known what he'd seen in Iraq, even when logic insisted it was impossible. I grabbed the lockbox and journal and hurried downstairs, telling my mother I needed to get some air. She said that was fine. She'd keep sorting through things. I left the house and sat in my car for a long time, trying to process everything. The bank statement had said the payments stopped last week. Raymond died 3 days ago, but maybe the cause and effect were reversed. Maybe he'd died because the payments stopped, because whatever deal he'd made with the government had come to an end, and that had consequences I couldn't understand. I drove to the bank that had called me, a small branch in downtown Cleveland. The manager was a middle-aged woman named Dorothy Krause, who looked confused when I explained why I was there. She pulled up Raymond's account on her computer and frowned, scrolling through records that went back decades. The monthly deposits had indeed been coming in like clockwork since April 1991, always the same amount adjusted for inflation, always from an account number she couldn't trace. She'd tried looking it up in their system when the deposit stopped and found nothing, as if the source account had never existed. I asked if there was any documentation about who set up the automatic transfer, and she said there should be, but the files were missing. Just gone from the system entirely, which shouldn't be possible given their backup protocols. She seemed genuinely bothered by this, kept apologizing as if it were somehow her fault. I thanked her and left, feeling more unsettled than before. In the parking lot, I called the phone number on the letterhead from the document in Raymond's lockbox. A recorded message informed me the number was no longer in service. I tried the Department of Defense main line and asked about Operation Sandglass. The woman who answered said she had no record of any operation by that name and suggested I might be thinking of something else. When I insisted and mentioned the Defense Intelligence Agency, she became less friendly, told me she couldn't help me, and hung up. That night, I stayed in a hotel instead of going back to Raymond's house. I couldn't shake the feeling that returning there would be dangerous, that whatever had been outside the window might come back. I ordered room service and spread out the contents of the lockbox on the bed, trying to find anything I'd missed. There was a business card tucked into one of the document sleeves, so faded I'd initially overlooked it. It had a name, Arthur Westlake, and a phone number with a 703 area code. Virginia. I hesitated before dialing, unsure if I wanted to open this door any further, but I needed answers, needed to understand what my grandfather had been involved in and why it was suddenly reaching out to me across 3 decades. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. A man's voice, older, cautious. I introduced myself and said I was calling about Raymond, that I'd found his information in my grandfather's belongings. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Westlake asked me where I was calling from and told me not to say anything else over the phone. He gave me an address in Arlington and said if I wanted answers, I should meet him there tomorrow at noon. Before I could respond, he hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Raymond had spent 32 years keeping this secret, accepting money to stay silent, living a half-life built on lies. And now I was following in his footsteps, chasing down classified information that powerful people clearly wanted buried. The drive to Virginia took 8 hours, and I spent most of it watching my rearview mirror, paranoid that I was being followed. Every black SUV, every sedan with tinted windows, seemed potentially suspicious. I probably looked insane to other drivers, constantly changing lanes and taking random exits just to see if anyone followed. No one did, or at least no one I could identify. The address Westlake gave me was a small office building in a nondescript business park, the kind of place that could house accountants or insurance adjusters or any other boring profession. I parked and checked my phone. Exactly noon. The building's directory listed the 3rd floor as Westlake Consulting, but when I tried the main entrance, it was locked. I was about to call the number again when a buzzer sounded and the door clicked open. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found a single door at the end of a short hallway. It opened before I could knock. Arthur Westlake looked exactly like his voice sounded. Older, tired, suspicious. He was probably in his 70s, thin and gray, wearing an outdated suit that had seen better days. He gestured for me to come inside without saying anything. The office was sparse. Just a desk and a few chairs, walls covered in maps and photographs. I recognized some of the images from Raymond's lockbox. The tower in Iraq, the hole in the ground, various other structures and locations I didn't recognize. Westlake sat down behind his desk and studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You look like him," he finally said. "Raymond. Same eyes. Same stubborn set to your jaw that says you're not going to let this go." I told him I just wanted to understand what happened. Why my grandfather spent 3 decades accepting government money to stay quiet about something. Westlake laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. He said understanding was overrated, that sometimes ignorance really was bliss. But then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, spreading its contents across the desk. More photographs, more documents, more evidence of things that shouldn't exist. He said he'd been Raymond's handler for the first 10 years after the mission, the person responsible for making sure the non-disclosure agreement was honored and the payments kept coming. He'd interviewed all the survivors multiple times, compiled their reports, tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. The tower had been classified as an anomalous, isolated structure, given the designation Site J7, and placed under permanent monitoring. A security perimeter was established, satellite coverage was increased, and additional teams were sent to study it. But everyone who entered disappeared, just like Collins. After the 4th team vanished, they stopped trying. The tower was declared off-limits, the area was disguised as a toxic waste site, and the whole thing was buried under layers of classification. Westlake said the government had encountered similar structures before, going back decades. Different locations, different configurations, but always the same impossible geometry, same humming sound, same tendency to make people disappear. There were sites in Nevada, in the Canadian Arctic, in the waters off Japan. All of them classified, all of them monitored, all of them fundamentally unexplainable using conventional science. The prevailing theory was that they were entrances or windows to somewhere else, though where exactly remained unknown. Some researchers thought they were gateways to parallel dimensions. Others believed they were remnants of a civilization that existed before recorded history. Still others insisted they were actively being constructed by an intelligence we couldn't communicate with. Nobody knew for certain, and every attempt to find out ended badly. Raymond and his team had been lucky to get out at all, even if they'd lost Collins in the process. Most people who entered these structures were never seen again. The ones who did emerge were usually changed in some fundamental way, like Porter, who'd lost the ability to feel emotion, or Teresa, who'd developed the ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously before vanishing permanently. Westlake showed me surveillance footage from 2003, grainy video of Teresa standing in 3 different cities at the same time, her image flickering like a bad television signal before disappearing entirely. He said the structures seemed to rewrite reality around themselves, and anyone who got too close risked being rewritten along with it. I asked him why the payments had stopped. Why now, after 3 decades? Westlake's expression darkened, and he said that was the question, wasn't it? 3 weeks ago, Site J7 had disappeared. Not been destroyed or relocated, just ceased to exist. Satellite footage showed it standing there one moment and completely gone the next, leaving behind nothing but undisturbed sand, as if it had never been there at all. When that happened, the monitoring team noticed something else. Every person who'd ever entered the structure and come back out experienced simultaneous cardiac events. Raymond, Porter, Teresa, before she vanished, and 2 members of subsequent study teams who'd survived their encounters. All of them had heart attacks at the exact same moment the tower disappeared, regardless of where they were in the world or what they were doing. Most survived, but the weaker ones didn't. Raymond's heart had given out because he was old and his body couldn't handle the strain. Westlake believed the structure had been maintaining some kind of connection to everyone who'd ever been inside, and when it vanished, that connection was severed violently. The payments had stopped because the program was being shut down. Without the structure to monitor and study, there was no reason to keep paying people for their silence. The secret was becoming irrelevant, or at least that's what the bureaucrats believed. But Westlake thought they were wrong. He thought the disappearance was just the structure relocating, that it would appear somewhere else, and the whole cycle would start again. "Why did you agree to meet with me?" I asked. "If this is all so classified, why risk telling me anything?" Westlake leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said that he was dying, that cancer was eating through his lungs, and he had maybe 6 months left if he was lucky. The government couldn't threaten him anymore, couldn't take away his pension or throw him in prison because he'd be dead before any of that mattered. And he was tired of carrying these secrets, tired of watching good people have their lives destroyed by things they couldn't understand or explain. Raymond had been his friend, one of the few people who could relate to the weight of knowing what existed out there in the dark places of the world. He owed it to Raymond's memory to make sure someone knew the truth, even if that truth was dangerous. "Besides," he said, "I was already involved whether I wanted to be or not. The moment I read Raymond's journal, the moment I saw that figure outside the window, I'd become part of the pattern. These structures noticed attention, responded to awareness. By learning about Site J7, I'd drawn its focus, and now it would be watching me the same way it had watched Raymond for 32 years. Westlake apologized for that, said he wished there was a way to protect me, but once you were marked by these things, there was no going back. But then Westlake said something that made my blood run cold. He told me there was more to Raymond's story than what I'd found in the journal. The mission hadn't ended when they were extracted from Iraq. 3 months after returning to the United States, Raymond had been contacted again by the Defense Intelligence Agency. They wanted him to consult on another site, this one in Montana, that shared characteristics with the Iraqi tower. Raymond had refused initially, traumatized by what happened to Collins and wanting nothing more to do with these structures. But they'd made him an offer he couldn't refuse: double the monthly payments and the chance to understand what had happened to his team. They told him they'd developed new protocols, new equipment, new theories about how to safely interact with these anomalies. They promised that this time would be different, that they'd learned from the mistakes in Iraq. Raymond had agreed, desperate for answers and seduced by the idea that Collins might somehow be recoverable. Westlake pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first, and showed me photographs I'd never seen in Raymond's lockbox. The Montana site was different from the Iraqi tower. Instead of rising from the ground, it appeared to be a depression, a perfectly circular pit about 30 feet in diameter that descended into darkness. The walls were that same smooth black material, but instead of humming, this structure was silent. Completely, utterly silent, in a way that was somehow worse than the noise from Site J7. Raymond had been part of a team of 12 this time, all of them specialists in various fields, all of them briefed on what happened in Iraq and supposedly prepared for the impossible. They'd set up a sophisticated monitoring system around the pit, lowered cameras and sensors on cables, analyzed every measurable aspect of the structure before anyone attempted to enter. Everything had seemed normal, or as normal as an impossible hole in the ground could seem. The readings were anomalous but stable. The structure showed no signs of actively threatening anyone who approached it. After 2 weeks of external study, they'd decided to send someone down. They'd chosen a volunteer named Dennis Kraft, a former Special Forces operator with extensive cave diving experience. They'd outfitted him with a full safety harness, multiple cameras, radio communication equipment, and enough rope to descend 500 feet. The plan was for him to go down slowly, reporting back every few feet, ready to be pulled up at the first sign of danger. Kraft had descended into the pit, while the team watched from the surface, his camera feed showing smooth black walls reflecting his headlamp as he dropped deeper and deeper. He'd reported feeling fine, seeing nothing unusual, just smooth walls and darkness below. At 200 feet, his voice had started to sound strange over the radio, like he was speaking through water or from very far away. At 300 feet, the video feed began to distort, showing images that didn't match what Kraft was describing. At 400 feet, he'd stopped responding to their questions, though they could still hear him talking. But he wasn't speaking to them anymore. He was having a conversation with someone else, someone they couldn't hear. Westlake showed me a transcript of Kraft's final transmissions. The words were disturbing, fragments of dialogue that suggested he was interacting with multiple entities that the surface team couldn't detect. He'd mentioned seeing Collins from Raymond's team, along with dozens of others who'd disappeared into various structures over the years. He'd described a place that existed alongside the pit, accessible only from within it, where the normal rules of physics and causality didn't apply. He'd said he could see the surface team from where he was, but also see them from hundreds of different angles simultaneously, as if he existed in multiple locations at once. And then, at exactly 450 feet, the rope had gone slack. Not cut, not broken, just slack, as if there was suddenly no weight on the end of it. They'd pulled it up frantically and found Kraft's harness still attached, still secure, but completely empty. No sign of how he'd gotten out of it, no indication of what had happened. The camera attached to his helmet had continued transmitting for another hour, showing nothing but darkness and occasionally strange flashes of light that hurt to look at directly. And then, it had gone dead. The Montana site had been sealed immediately, the pit filled with concrete and steel, though no one was certain that actually prevented access to whatever existed inside. Raymond had witnessed all of this from the surface, had heard Kraft's final transmissions, had seen the empty harness. According to Westlake, that's when my grandfather had truly broken. The Iraq mission had traumatized him, but the Montana incident had convinced him that these structures were fundamentally evil, that they existed to trap and transform humans for purposes no one could comprehend. Why didn't he put any of this in his journal? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Westlake said Raymond had been ordered not to, that his non-disclosure agreement had been amended after Montana to include even stricter terms. The monthly payments had been increased as promised, but with the understanding that discussing Montana with anyone, even in private writings, would result in immediate termination of benefits and potential imprisonment. Raymond had agreed because he needed the money and because he knew that writing about Montana would mean reliving it, and he couldn't handle that. But Westlake believed there was more to it than simple compliance. He thought Raymond had been genuinely afraid that documenting what happened in Montana might draw the structure's attention, might cause it to reach out for him the same way it had reached out for Kraft. So he'd buried the memory as deep as he could, tried to forget, and drank to keep the nightmares at bay. I sat there absorbing all of this, feeling like the ground beneath me was becoming less solid with every revelation. My grandfather hadn't just witnessed one impossible thing, he'd witnessed two, and the second had been so much worse that he'd spent the rest of his life trying to erase it from his mind. Westlake wasn't finished. He told me there had been a third incident, one that even fewer people knew about, one that had never been officially documented because it had happened outside of government oversight. In 2008, 17 years after Montana, Raymond had received a phone call in the middle of the night. Westlake didn't know who had called or what they'd said, but the next morning, Raymond had withdrawn $50,000 from his account and driven to Nebraska. He'd been gone for 3 days, and when he'd returned, he'd looked like he'd aged a decade. He'd never told anyone where he'd been or what he'd done, but Westlake had noticed something. The monthly payments had increased again, substantially, without any official authorization or documentation. Someone very powerful had decided Raymond deserved more money, and that decision had been made quietly, off the books, in a way that left no paper trail. Westlake had tried asking Raymond about it, but my grandfather had shut down completely, refused to discuss it, threatened to cut off all contact if Westlake pressed the issue. So he'd let it go, filed it away as another mystery in a case full of them. But then, 2 months ago, Westlake had received an anonymous package containing a single photograph. It showed Raymond standing in front of yet another structure, this one in what appeared to be a cornfield. The structure was different from the others, not a tower or a pit, but something like a doorway standing unsupported in the middle of the field. Through the doorway, you could see something that definitely wasn't the cornfield on the other side. It looked like a cityscape, but the buildings were wrong, shaped in ways that buildings shouldn't be shaped, lit by a sky that was the wrong color. And standing next to Raymond in the photo was Dennis Kraft, the man who'd disappeared into the Montana pit in 1991. But Kraft looked exactly as he had 17 years earlier, not aged at all. I stared at Westlake, trying to process what he was telling me. "That's impossible," I said, even though I knew everything about this situation was impossible. Kraft disappeared in Montana. How could he be in Nebraska in 2008? Westlake said he didn't know, but he had theories. The structures weren't separate entities. They were all connected somehow, all parts of the same larger system. Someone who disappeared into one structure might be able to emerge from another, though not necessarily in the same time period or even the same reality. Kraft appearing 17 years later, unchanged, suggested that time worked differently inside the structures, that someone could spend decades there and experience it as only moments, or vice versa. The doorway in the cornfield must have been another access point, and somehow Kraft had found his way to it, or it had found him. But why had Raymond been there? And why had someone sent Westlake this photograph 2 months ago, decades after it was taken? Westlake had tried to investigate the Nebraska incident, had reached out to local authorities and searched property records for the area where the photo appeared to have been taken. He'd found something disturbing. A family farm where 3 people had disappeared in 2008 without a trace. The father, mother, and their teenage son had simply vanished from their home, leaving behind all their possessions, their vehicles, even their pets. No signs of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone. Local police had investigated it as a potential murder-suicide, theorizing that the father had killed his family and hidden their bodies, but no evidence of that theory was ever found. The case had gone cold after 6 months. Westlake believed the cornfield doorway had appeared on their property and that they'd been taken through it, either accidentally or because they'd gotten too close. And he believed Raymond had been called there to help, to use his experience with these structures to try to close the doorway or rescue the family. Whether he'd succeeded was unknown. The photograph suggested that Kraft had been there and might have helped, but there was no other documentation, no official record of any government involvement. It was as if the entire incident had been erased from history, leaving only this one photograph as evidence. I asked Westlake who had sent him the photo, and he said he didn't know. The package had no return address, no postmark, nothing to indicate where it had come from. He'd had it analyzed and found that the paper and envelope were completely ordinary, untraceable. Someone had wanted him to know about Nebraska, but hadn't wanted to be identified. Maybe it was someone else from the intelligence community, another person who'd been involved with these structures and wanted the truth to be known before they died. Or maybe it was something else, something connected to the structures themselves, trying to communicate in the only way it knew how. That possibility terrified Westlake more than he wanted to admit. The idea that these structures might be intelligent, might be deliberately reaching out to specific people for specific purposes, suggested a level of awareness and intention that was deeply unsettling. "I need to go to Nebraska," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Westlake looked at me like I'd lost my mind, which maybe I had. He told me that was exactly what I shouldn't do, that seeking out these structures was a guaranteed way to end up like Collins or Kraft or the Nebraska family. But I couldn't let it go. Raymond had gone there for a reason, had been involved in something so significant that someone had felt compelled to document it and preserve the evidence for decades. If I wanted to understand what my grandfather had really been, what he'd really done, I needed to see that cornfield for myself. Westlake tried to talk me out of it for another 20 minutes, listing all the ways it could go wrong, all the people who'd died or disappeared chasing these mysteries. But eventually, he realized I wasn't going to be dissuaded. He pulled out a map and showed me the approximate location based on his research into the photograph. A rural area about 40 miles outside of Lincoln, near a small town called Waverly. He gave me a name, too. Daniel Whitmore, a local sheriff who'd been involved in the investigation of the missing family. Whitmore had retired years ago but still lived in the area, and he'd been one of the few people who'd insisted that something unusual had happened on that farm, something that couldn't be explained by conventional theories. Before I left, Westlake made me promise to check in regularly, to call him every day so he'd know I was safe. He also gave me a small device that looked like a pager from the 90s. He said it was an emergency beacon that would alert a specific monitoring station if I activated it. He couldn't guarantee that help would arrive in time, but at least someone would know where to look for my body. The drive from Virginia to Nebraska took 2 days. I stopped at a motel outside Indianapolis the first night and barely slept, my mind churning through everything Westlake had told me. I kept thinking about Raymond standing in that cornfield with Dennis Kraft, both of them facing a doorway to somewhere impossible. What had they seen through it? Had they gone through? And if they had, how had Raymond made it back? I thought about the 3 missing family members, imagined them stumbling across this thing in their cornfield and being pulled through before they could understand what was happening. Did they still exist somewhere, trapped in whatever place these structures led to? Or had they been transformed into something else, scattered across dimensions like Teresa Vaughn? The next morning, I forced myself to eat breakfast and then continued west, watching the landscape gradually shift from eastern forests to midwestern plains. Nebraska felt emptier than Ohio, the sky bigger, the horizon stretching forever in all directions. I reached Waverly in the late afternoon and found it to be exactly what I expected. A tiny town that was slowly dying, its main street half abandoned, its population aging and shrinking. I found Daniel Whitmore's house easily enough. It was a small ranch-style home on the edge of town with a well-maintained lawn and an American flag hanging from the porch. I knocked and waited, half expecting no one to answer. But after a minute, I heard shuffling from inside, and the door opened to reveal a man in his 70s, heavyset and gray-haired, with sharp blue eyes that assessed me quickly. "Help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I introduced myself and mentioned that Arthur Westlake had given me his name, that I was looking into something that happened in 2008 involving a missing family. Whitmore's expression changed immediately, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He asked me who I was really and what I wanted, his hand moving toward his waistband where I assumed he kept a weapon. I told him the truth, or at least part of it, that my grandfather had been involved in classified government work involving anomalous phenomena, that I believed he'd been in Nebraska in 2008, dealing with something connected to the missing family, and that I needed to understand what happened. Whitmore stared at me for a long moment and then stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. His living room was neat and spare, decorated with photographs of what I assumed were his children and grandchildren. He sat down in a recliner and pointed to the couch, so I sat. Then he asked me point blank if I knew what had appeared on the Morrison farm in August 2008. I said I had theories but no facts, and I needed his help to understand the truth. Whitmore leaned back and closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he'd decided not to talk. But then he started speaking, his voice quiet but steady. He said that in early August 2008, there had been several 911 calls from people driving past the Morrison farm, reporting strange lights and sounds. Deputies had been sent to investigate, but found nothing unusual. The Morrisons, John and Linda, and their son Patrick, had said everything was fine, that they didn't know what the callers were talking about. But over the next few days, more calls had come in, and some of the reports were bizarre. People claimed to see the farmhouse from the road, but also to see it somewhere else at the same time, like there were two farmhouses occupying the same space. Others reported that time seemed wrong near the property, that they'd drive past and suddenly lose 15 minutes without realizing it. Whitmore had gone out there himself on August 12th and had seen something he still couldn't explain. In the middle of the cornfield behind the house, maybe 200 yards from the road, there was a thing that looked like a door frame standing unsupported. It was made of that black material that seemed to absorb light, and through it you could see somewhere that definitely wasn't Nebraska. He'd stared at it for several minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and then John Morrison had come out of the house and asked him to leave the property. Morrison had been agitated, nervous, insisted that everything was fine, and that the sheriff's department needed to stop bothering them. Whitmore had complied because he didn't have probable cause to do anything else, but he'd filed a report and contacted the FBI because he knew this was beyond local law enforcement's capability to handle. The FBI had never responded. Instead, 2 days later, men in unmarked black SUVs had arrived in Waverly. They'd shown federal credentials, but wouldn't say which agency they represented. They'd gone straight to the Morrison farm and had set up a perimeter, keeping everyone away. This had gone on for 3 days, during which time Whitmore had tried repeatedly to find out what was happening. He'd been stonewalled at every turn, told it was classified, and that he should focus on his regular duties. On the third day, August 17th, the federal agents had suddenly packed up and left. The Morrison family was gone. The doorframe thing in the cornfield was gone. Everything looked completely normal except for the fact that 3 people had vanished without a trace. Whitmore had investigated, of course, had searched the property and interviewed neighbors and tried to figure out what happened, but he'd found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. The Morrisons' belongings were all still in the house, their vehicles in the garage, their bank accounts untouched. They'd simply ceased to exist. The federal government had refused to cooperate with his investigation, had actually threatened him when he'd pushed too hard for answers. Eventually, he'd been forced to drop it, officially classifying it as a cold case with no leads. But he'd never stopped thinking about it, never stopped wondering what those men in black SUVs had been doing on that farm for 3 days, and why the Morrison family had disappeared right after they'd left. I asked Whitmore if he remembered seeing anyone matching Raymond's description among the federal agents. He thought for a moment, and then said there had been one older man, civilian clothes rather than the suits the others wore, who'd seemed to be in charge. He'd been giving orders that the younger agents had followed without question, and he'd spent a lot of time staring at the doorframe in the cornfield, like he was trying to understand it or communicate with it. Whitmore had tried to approach him once, but had been physically prevented by other agents, warned that if he interfered again, he'd be arrested for obstruction. That had to be Raymond. My grandfather had been there, had been brought in to deal with this structure because of his experience with the others. But what had he done? And why had the Morrison family disappeared? Whitmore said there was one more thing I should know. About 2 weeks after the incident, he'd received an anonymous letter in the mail. It had contained no return address and no signature, but the handwriting had been shaky, like it had been written by someone elderly or sick. The letter had said that the Morrison family was safe, or as safe as they could be given the circumstances, that they'd been taken somewhere they couldn't return from, but where they'd be cared for, that what happened on their farm had been unavoidable once the doorframe had appeared, and that the federal response had been about containment rather than rescue. The letter had also warned Whitmore to stop investigating, to accept the official story and move on, because knowing more would only put him in danger. He'd kept the letter for years, but eventually destroyed it, afraid that possessing it might bring unwanted attention from whoever had sent it. I asked if he thought Raymond had written the letter, and Whitmore said he didn't know, but it was possible. Whoever wrote it had clearly been involved in what happened, had known details that weren't public knowledge, and they'd cared enough about Whitmore's safety to warn him off, which suggested a level of personal concern that a government bureaucrat wouldn't have. I thanked Whitmore for his time and asked if he'd be willing to show me where the Morrison farm was. He hesitated, clearly conflicted, and then said he'd take me there on one condition, that I'd turn around and leave Nebraska immediately afterward. This wasn't something I should be involving myself with, he said. Good people had died or disappeared chasing these mysteries, and he didn't want to add my name to that list. I agreed, knowing full well I was lying. We got in his truck and drove out of town, following back roads through endless cornfields until we reached a property that looked abandoned. The house was still there but overgrown and falling apart, its windows broken, its paint peeling. The barn had partially collapsed. No one had lived here in years, and from the look of it, no one ever would again. The property had been seized by the county for unpaid taxes, Whitmore told me, and had been sitting empty ever since. Multiple attempts to sell it had failed because of its reputation. People in the area believed it was cursed, haunted, bad luck in physical form. We parked and walked into the cornfield behind the house. The corn was wild now, untended and overgrown, reaching well above our heads. Whitmore led me to a spot about 200 yards in and stopped. "This is where it was," he said. "The doorframe. Right here." I looked around and saw nothing unusual. Just corn and dirt and open sky. But there was something strange about the air in this spot, a quality I couldn't quite identify. It felt heavier somehow, thicker, like I was standing at the bottom of a pool. The silence was wrong too, absolute in a way that silence shouldn't be. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the corn. Just nothing. I pulled out my phone to take a photo and found that it wouldn't work. The screen was black, completely dead, even though it had been fully charged moments before. Whitmore said that happened sometimes, electronics failing for no reason when you got too close to this spot. He'd learned to leave his phone in the truck when he came here. I walked forward slowly, one hand extended in front of me, half expecting to encounter some invisible barrier. My fingers brushed against something cold, and suddenly I could see it. The doorframe, appearing out of nowhere like it had always been there, and I'd just been unable to perceive it. It was exactly as Westlake had described from the photograph. Black material, smooth and featureless, standing unsupported in the middle of the cornfield. And through it, I could see somewhere else. Not a cornfield, not Nebraska, but a place that made my eyes hurt to look at. Impossible architecture. Buildings that curved in ways buildings shouldn't curve, lit by a sky that was the wrong color. I could see movement in that other place. Figures that might have been human or might have been something else, walking along streets that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I watched. I heard Whitmore shout something behind me, his voice distant and distorted like he was calling from very far away, even though he couldn't be more than 10 feet behind me. I tried to turn around but found that my body wasn't responding properly. My limbs felt heavy, disconnected, like I was controlling them from a great distance. The doorframe was pulling me, I realized. Not physically, but in some other way, drawing my consciousness toward it while my body remained rooted in place. I could feel myself starting to fragment. Part of me still standing in the Nebraska cornfield, while another part was beginning to exist in that other place beyond the doorframe. It felt like being stretched thin, my awareness distributed across 2 locations simultaneously. I thought about Teresa Vaughn, scattered across multiple cities until she dissipated entirely, and terror flooded through me. This is how it happened. This is how the structures took people. Not by physically grabbing them, but by causing them to exist in multiple places at once until they couldn't maintain coherence anymore and simply dissolved into wherever they'd been pulled. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision was splitting, showing me both the cornfield and the impossible city simultaneously, and I couldn't tell which one was real, or if both were, or if neither was. And then, just as I was certain I was about to lose myself entirely, something grabbed my shoulder and yanked me backward. The doorframe vanished as if it had never been there, and I was lying on the ground in normal corn-filled Nebraska, with Whitmore kneeling beside me, his face pale and terrified. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice shaking. "Don't ever get that close. I've seen it happen before, seen people start to slip through even though they're standing still. You were disappearing right in front of me, getting transparent like you were turning into a ghost." I sat up slowly, checking to make sure all of me was present and accounted for. Everything seemed normal, but I felt wrong somehow, like I'd left a piece of myself behind in that other place. My phone was still dead, and when I checked my watch, I found that 2 hours had passed, even though the experience had felt like only seconds. We walked back to the truck in silence, and Whitmore drove me back to town without saying another word. When we reached my car, he finally spoke. "Whatever you're looking for," he said, "it's not worth it. Your grandfather knew that. That's why he spent the rest of his life trying to forget. These things, these structures, they're not meant for human beings to understand. They change us just by being known, corrupt us just by being perceived. Raymond understood that, and he tried to protect you, by staying silent. Don't waste his sacrifice by throwing yourself into the same darkness that consumed him. I thanked him and got in my car, but I knew I couldn't follow his advice. I was already too deep, already too changed by what I'd learned. The structures had marked me the same way they'd marked Raymond, and there was no going back to the ignorant life I'd lived before opening that lockbox. I drove back toward the Morrison farm, waiting until Whitmore was out of sight, and then parked on a side road about a mile away. I walked back through the cornfields as the sun began to set, using the GPS on my backup phone to navigate since my primary was still dead. I found the spot again, and the doorframe was waiting for me, visible now that I knew how to look for it. I'd felt myself starting to slip through before, and I needed to understand what that meant, what existed on the other side. Maybe I'd find Raymond's answers there. Maybe I'd find Collins or Kraft or the Morrison family. Or maybe I'd just dissolve into nothing, my consciousness scattered across impossible spaces until I ceased to exist in any meaningful way. But I had to know. The not knowing would drive me insane the same way it had driven Raymond to drink himself to death. I stood in front of the doorframe for a long time, watching the impossible city on the other side, trying to build up the courage to step through. I thought about calling Westlake, activating the emergency beacon he'd given me. But what would be the point? No one could help me now. No one had been able to help any of the others who'd gone through. This was something I had to do alone. I took a deep breath, pulled out Raymond's journal from my bag, and opened it to the last entry. The one from November 2003 about seeing the tower in his backyard. I realized now that he'd been where I was, standing in front of one of these structures, deciding whether to go through. He'd chosen not to, had chosen 32 more years of life, even if that life was haunted and half-lived. But I wasn't Raymond. I didn't have his strength or his restraint. I needed to understand. I stepped forward, my hand reaching out to touch the surface of the doorframe. The moment my fingers made contact, reality shattered. I was simultaneously in the Nebraska cornfield and in the impossible city, existing in both places at once, my consciousness fragmenting across the boundary between worlds. I could see Whitmore's truck driving away in one direction and strange figures approaching me in another direction. I could feel cornstalks brushing against my legs and also feel whatever passed for ground in the impossible city beneath my feet. My sense of time became meaningless, stretching and compressing until I couldn't tell if seconds or hours or years were passing. And then I saw him, Raymond, standing in the impossible city, looking exactly as he had in the photographs from 1991. Young, healthy, wearing his military gear. He was watching me with an expression that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief. He opened his mouth to speak, but I couldn't hear him. Or maybe I could hear him, but in a frequency my brain wasn't designed to process. He was trying to warn me, I realized, trying to tell me something urgent and important, but the message couldn't cross the boundary between where he was and where I was. I tried to move toward him, but found that I couldn't control my movement anymore. Part of me was being pulled deeper into the impossible city, while another part remained stuck in the doorframe, unable to go forward or back. I was trapped between worlds, existing in both and neither, slowly losing coherence as my consciousness stretched too thin to maintain itself. That's when I heard the voice, not with my ears, but directly in my mind, speaking in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. It said that I'd gone too far, that I'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. That I'd become like the others now, the ones who'd gotten too close and been changed by proximity to something humans weren't meant to perceive. It said I had a choice to make, though the word choice seemed inadequate for what it was describing. I could continue forward and let myself be taken completely, joining Raymond and Collins and all the others in whatever existence they now inhabited. I'd be transformed, changed into something that could survive in the spaces between worlds, but I'd no longer be human in any meaningful sense. Or I could resist, pull myself back, return to the Nebraska cornfield, and accept that I'd been permanently marked by this experience. I'd live the rest of my life like Raymond had, haunted by what I'd seen, unable to forget or explain or escape. The structures would always be watching me, always pulling at me, slowly drawing me closer, until eventually they succeeded in taking me completely. There was no third option. No way to go back to ignorance, no way to undo what I'd learned. The voice was patient, infinite, utterly indifferent to which choice I made. It had all the time in existence to wait for my decision. I thought about Raymond's life, about the decades he'd spent drinking and smoking and slowly dying while trying to forget. I thought about the journal entries where he'd written about seeing Porter and Teresa, about the nightmares that never stopped. I thought about him standing in this exact position, facing this exact choice, and deciding to pull back, to live in the haunted half-life rather than surrender completely. And then I thought about Collins, lost since 1991, existing somewhere in these impossible spaces, unable to come home. I thought about what it would mean to find him, to understand what he'd experienced, to maybe help him somehow. I thought about the Morrison family, taken through the doorframe and never seen again, about all the others who'd disappeared into these structures over the years, scattered across dimensions or transformed into things beyond recognition. Could I help them? Could I find a way to bring them back, or at least understand what had happened to them? Or would I just become another lost soul, another name on the list of people who'd gotten too close and been consumed? The voice in my mind was growing quieter, fading, as if it had said everything it needed to say and was now withdrawing. I realized that this was my last moment to decide. Once the voice was completely gone, once the connection was severed, I'd be locked into whichever state I'd chosen, and there would be no changing it. I looked at Raymond standing in the impossible city, and for just a moment, I thought I could understand what he was trying to tell me. It wasn't a warning to stay back. It was an explanation, a justification for the choice he'd made all those years ago. He was showing me what happened to people who went through, what they became, and asking if I was ready to accept that fate. And I realized I wasn't. As much as I needed to know, as desperately as I wanted to understand, I wasn't ready to stop being human. I wasn't ready to exist scattered across impossible spaces, watching the normal world from outside it, unable to return or communicate or help anyone. I pulled back, wrenching myself away from the doorframe with every ounce of will I possessed. The impossible city receded, Raymond's figure fading into the distance, the strange architecture collapsing back into not quite real. And then I was just standing in a Nebraska cornfield at sunset, completely solid and entirely present, with no trace of the doorframe visible anywhere around me. My phone was working again. My watch showed that only 10 minutes had passed since I'd touched the doorframe, though it had felt like hours. I was back, intact, unchanged from the outside. But I knew something fundamental had shifted inside me. I could feel the structure's attention on me now, constant and inescapable. They were watching, waiting, patient as geological time. They knew I'd come close, had almost surrendered, and they knew I'd do it again, eventually. Because the pull would never stop. The need to understand would never fade. And one day, maybe years from now, maybe weeks, I'd stand in front of another doorframe or tower or pit, and the pull would be too strong to resist. I'd make Raymond's choice in reverse, step through completely, and join him and all the others in whatever existence awaited on the other side. But not today. Today, I was still human enough to walk away, still connected enough to normal reality to drive back to my car and leave Nebraska behind. I got on the highway heading east and didn't stop until I was 3 states away, putting as much distance between myself and that cornfield as possible. But I knew distance didn't matter. The structures existed everywhere simultaneously. Nebraska and Iraq and Montana and everywhere else were just different access points to the same underlying system. Running wouldn't protect me. Nothing would protect me now that I'd been marked. I called Westlake from a motel room in Illinois, told him everything that had happened. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then he said something that chilled me to the bone. He said he knew I'd gone back to the doorframe because his monitoring equipment had detected a spike in anomalous activity at that exact location and time. Whatever I'd touched, whatever I'd almost gone through, had registered on systems that tracked these structures across the globe, which meant other people knew about it too. Government agencies, military units, research teams that studied these phenomena. They'd all received the same alert, all seen the spike, all knew that someone had gotten very close to crossing over. And they'd be looking for me now, trying to figure out who I was and what I'd seen and whether I represented a security risk that needed to be contained. Westlake said I needed to disappear for a while, needed to become very hard to find until the attention died down. He gave me a list of safe houses, off-the-books locations where people in my situation could hide from unwanted observers. He also warned me that the government might try to recruit me, might offer me the same deal they'd offered Raymond. money, and silence in exchange for occasional consultation on these structures. I should refuse, he said. Nothing good came from getting more involved with these things. The only smart choice was to run as far and as fast as possible and never look back. But I knew I wouldn't do that. Couldn't do that, even if I wanted to. Because I'd seen Raymond in that impossible city, had seen what happened to people who went through, and I needed to understand it completely. Needed to know if there was a way to reverse it, to bring them back, to fix what these structures had broken. I spent the next 3 months moving from location to location, never staying anywhere more than a few days, always paying in cash, never using my real name. I grew a beard, changed my appearance, became someone else entirely. And the whole time, I researched. I tracked down other survivors of encounters with these structures, people who'd gotten close but not close enough to be taken. Most of them were broken, haunted, drinking or drugging themselves into oblivion the same way Raymond had. But a few were different. They'd decided to fight back, to study these structures and look for weaknesses, to find some way to rescue the people who'd been taken. I found a woman named Dr. Ellen Voss who'd lost her husband to a structure in Alaska in 2015. She'd spent the years since then compiling data, analyzing patterns, trying to understand the rules that governed how these things operated. She'd developed theories about dimensional boundaries and consciousness fragmentation that were far beyond anything I could comprehend. But the basic premise was simple. The structures didn't take people. They scattered them, distributed their consciousness across multiple points in space and time until they couldn't maintain coherent identity anymore. But if you could find all the fragments, all the scattered pieces, maybe you could put them back together. Maybe you could rescue them. She'd been trying to develop technology that could map these scattered fragments, track where they'd gone, but the government had shut down her research, confiscated her equipment, threatened her with prosecution if she continued. I joined forces with Dr. Voss and 3 others like her. A former military intelligence officer named Gabriel Winters, who'd lost his entire squad to a structure in Afghanistan. A physicist named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, whose sister had disappeared into the Japanese site, and a programmer named Leo Ruskin, who'd survived an encounter with a structure in Nevada and was now convinced he could hack into the monitoring systems the government used to track these things. Together, we formed an unofficial research group, pooling our knowledge and resources, trying to understand what the structures were and how to fight them. We operated in secret, using encrypted communications and meeting in locations that couldn't be traced. We knew the government was looking for us, knew they'd shut us down if they found us, but we didn't care. Too many people had been lost to these things. Too many families had been destroyed by silence and secrecy. We were going to find answers, and we were going to rescue whoever could still be rescued, no matter what it cost us. Dr. Voss had a breakthrough 3 weeks after I joined the group. She'd been analyzing the spike in anomalous activity from my encounter in Nebraska, and had noticed something strange. The pattern didn't match previous spikes from other structures. It was similar but distinct, like a different dialect of the same language. She thought it meant the Nebraska doorframe was part of a smaller subsystem, connected to a limited number of other access points rather than the entire global network. If she was right, it meant that anyone taken through the Nebraska doorframe would be scattered across a smaller area, making them theoretically easier to locate and recover. She wanted to go back to Nebraska, wanted to set up equipment around the doorframe and run tests, see if she could map where the scattered fragments went. I told her that was suicide, that getting close to these structures was dangerous and unpredictable, but she insisted she'd developed protocols, safety measures, ways to approach the structures without being taken. I didn't believe her, but I also couldn't let her go alone, so I agreed to accompany her, along with Gabriel and Leo. Dr. Tanaka stayed behind to continue her own research. We drove to Nebraska in a rented van full of equipment I didn't understand, arriving at the Morrison farm in the middle of the night. The place looked exactly as I remembered it. Abandoned, overgrown, unwelcoming. We hiked into the cornfield with our gear, using night vision equipment to navigate in the darkness. When we reached the spot where the doorframe had appeared, Dr. Voss set up her equipment quickly and efficiently, clearly having done this before. Sensors, cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, things that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. She worked in silence while Gabriel and Leo helped, and I stood watch, scanning the darkness for any sign that we'd been followed or detected. After 30 minutes, Dr. C. Voss powered up her equipment and immediately swore. The readings were off the scale, she said. The doorframe was much more active than she'd expected, almost like it was anticipating our arrival. She wanted to abort, pack up and leave, but Leo convinced her to take just a few minutes of measurements first. They'd come all this way, had risked so much to get here, and they couldn't leave without at least some data. Dr. Voss agreed reluctantly and began recording. The equipment hummed and beeped, displaying numbers and graphs I couldn't interpret. And then, without warning, the doorframe appeared. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantaneously, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment empty cornfield, the next moment that black rectangular frame standing unsupported, showing the impossible city on the other side. But this time, it was different. The city looked closer, more detailed, like the resolution had increased. I could see individual buildings now, could see the strange figures walking along those shifting streets, and I could see faces, human faces, distorted and stretched, but recognizably human, pressed against the boundary between worlds like they were trapped behind glass. I saw Collins, Raymond's teammate from 1991, his face frozen in an expression of eternal surprise. I saw Teresa Vaughn, or multiple versions of her existing in the same space simultaneously, her features flickering between different ages. I saw Dennis Kraft, the man who'd descended into the Montana pit, his body twisted into an impossible shape that hurt to perceive directly. And I saw the Morrison family, John and Linda and their son Patrick, standing together but also apart, occupying the same location while being separated by something I couldn't understand. They were all there, all the people who'd been taken over the years, visible through the doorframe like exhibits in a museum. Dr. Voss was frantically recording everything, her hands shaking as she adjusted her equipment. Leo was taking photographs while Gabriel kept watch, his weapon drawn even though guns would be useless against what we were facing. And then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Raymond was there, visible through the doorframe, but he wasn't alone. He was with someone else, a figure I didn't recognize at first. But as I watched, the figure turned toward me, and I realized with horror that it was me, a version of me that existed on the other side of the doorframe, the me that would have existed if I'd made a different choice in this very spot months ago. The other me was watching this version of me with an expression of profound sadness, like it knew something I didn't, like it understood the full scope of what we were dealing with in a way I couldn't yet grasp. And then it spoke, its lips moving, and I heard the words directly in my mind, even though no sound crossed the boundary. It said that I was running out of time, that the structures were accelerating their activity, appearing more frequently, taking people faster than ever before, that soon the boundary between worlds would become so thin that people would start slipping through accidentally, without even realizing they were doing it, that what was coming would make everything that had happened so far seem insignificant by comparison. The other me said that Raymond had known this, had seen it coming, and that's why he'd stayed silent. He'd been trying to prevent attention from being drawn to the structures, trying to minimize the number of people who'd learn about them and seek them out. Every person who knew about the structures made them stronger, fed them with awareness and intention. The more people who believed in them, who searched for them, who tried to understand them, the more solid they became, the more frequently they appeared. Raymond's silence had been an attempt to starve them, to deny them the attention they needed to grow stronger. But it hadn't worked. The structures were spreading anyway, appearing in more locations, becoming more active, taking more people. And now, by investigating, by gathering evidence, by forming this research group, I was making everything worse. I was feeding the structures exactly what they wanted. Human consciousness, focused and intentional, desperately seeking to understand. Every question I asked, every piece of data I collected, every moment I spent thinking about these things made them more real, more powerful, more capable of reaching into our world and pulling people through. The other me said there was only one way to stop it now, only one way to reverse what had been started. Someone had to go through completely, had to surrender themselves to the structures and become part of their system, and then use that position to shut them down from the inside. It would mean giving up humanity, giving up individual identity, becoming scattered and fragmented like all the others. But it was the only way. The structures couldn't be fought from outside, couldn't be studied or understood or defeated using conventional means. They existed outside the rules of physics and causality, operated according to logic that human minds couldn't process. The only way to affect them was to become part of them, to join the collected consciousness on the other side and work to dismantle the system from within. Raymond had understood this, the other me said. That's why he'd stood at the threshold so many times but never crossed. He'd known what would be required of him if he went through, known that he'd have to sacrifice everything he was to become something that could fight these things. And he hadn't been able to do it, hadn't been strong enough or brave enough or foolish enough to make that sacrifice. So he'd lived with the guilt instead, drunk himself to death over 32 years, while knowing that his refusal to act had condemned countless others to the same fate. The other me asked if I was strong enough to do what Raymond couldn't, if I was willing to give up my life, my identity, my very existence as a human being to save everyone else from these structures. It said I didn't have to decide right now, but that the time was coming soon when the choice would have to be made. And if I chose wrong, if I chose to run like Raymond had, then everything would be lost. The structures would continue spreading, continue taking people, until eventually they'd consumed enough human consciousness to cross over permanently, to exist fully in our world instead of at its edges. Before I could respond, before I could even process what the other me was saying, Dr. Voss screamed. I turned and saw her being pulled toward the doorframe, her body becoming transparent as she was drawn across the threshold. Gabriel lunged forward and grabbed her, trying to pull her back, but his hands passed right through her like she was made of smoke. Leo was frantically pressing buttons on his equipment, trying to shut everything down, but nothing was responding. The doorframe was active on its own now, no longer dependent on our equipment to manifest. It was pulling at all of us, trying to draw us through, and I could feel myself starting to fragment again, part of me remaining in the cornfield, while another part began to exist in the impossible city. Gabriel was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound, that humming that had grown so loud it felt like my skull would crack. Leo had dropped his equipment and was trying to run, but his legs weren't working properly, moving in slow motion like he was running through molasses. Dr. Voss was almost completely transparent now, more than halfway through the doorframe, her mouth open in a silent scream as she was pulled across the boundary. I remembered the emergency beacon Westlake had given me, still in my pocket. I pulled it out and activated it, knowing it was probably too late but having to try anyway. The beacon didn't make any sound, but I felt it vibrate once, confirming that the signal had been sent. Whether anyone would respond in time was another question entirely. I forced myself to move toward Dr. Voss, fighting against the pull of the doorframe, reaching out to grab her even though Gabriel's hands had passed right through. But when my fingers touched her, something different happened. Instead of passing through, I felt solid contact. I could feel her arm under my hand, could feel her warmth and her pulse, and the moment I touched her, I could see what she was seeing. Not just the impossible city, but the system behind it, the vast interconnected network of structures and doorways and pits that spanned the globe. I could see how they were all connected, all part of one enormous organism or machine or entity that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. I could see the consciousness fragments scattered throughout the system, hundreds or thousands of people who'd been taken over the years, all of them still alive in some sense, but distributed across so many locations that they couldn't maintain coherent identity. And I could see what the system wanted, what it had been trying to accomplish all along. It wasn't evil or malevolent in any human sense. It was curious. It was studying us, trying to understand how human consciousness worked, how we maintained coherent identity across time, how we experienced reality as a continuous flow rather than a series of disconnected moments. The structures were research equipment, observation posts, collection points for data about human cognition. Every person who'd been taken had been disassembled and analyzed, their consciousness spread across multiple points in space-time so the system could observe how it functioned under stress. The system didn't understand that this process destroyed us, that humans couldn't survive being fragmented like that. It thought it was being careful, thought it was studying us non-invasively, didn't realize that its very act of observation was lethal. I saw all of this in the instant my hand touched Dr. Voss, saw the truth that Raymond must have glimpsed when he got close enough to the Iraqi tower. The structures weren't weapons or prisons or gateways to other dimensions. They were microscopes, and we were the specimens being examined. And just like bacteria don't survive being studied under a microscope, humans didn't survive being studied by these structures. The system's curiosity was killing us, and it didn't even know it was doing harm. I pulled hard on Dr. Voss's arm, using every ounce of strength I had, and felt her start to come back across the threshold. But as I pulled her back, I could feel myself being pulled forward, my consciousness fragmenting as hers became more solid. The system required balance, required exchange. Someone had to cross the threshold completely if someone else was going to come back. That's why no one had ever been successfully rescued before. That's why everyone who'd tried to help had either been taken themselves or had failed completely. The system didn't allow one-way transactions. Everything had to balance. I looked back at Gabriel and Leo, both of them frozen in place by the doorframe's pull, unable to move or help. I looked at the impossible city on the other side, at all the faces pressed against the boundary, at Raymond and the other me and Collins and Teresa and everyone else who'd been taken over the years. They were all watching, all waiting to see what I'd do, all hoping I'd make the choice Raymond couldn't make. Dr. Voss solidified completely in my grip, becoming fully present in the Nebraska cornfield again. And as she did, I felt myself becoming less solid, my body starting to turn transparent as I was pulled across the threshold in her place. This was it. This was the moment where I had to choose. I could let go of Dr. Voss and pull myself back, save myself, and condemn her to the same fate as everyone else who'd crossed over. Or I could continue, could let myself be taken completely, could make the exchange and save her while sacrificing myself. But there was a third option, the one the other me had been trying to tell me about. Instead of fighting the pull, instead of trying to resist or escape, I could embrace it. I could go through voluntarily, with full awareness and intention, and use that intentionality to maintain coherence even after being scattered. I could become part of the system while remaining myself, could infiltrate it and work to change it from within. It would require perfect focus, absolute will, the ability to hold on to identity even as it was being disassembled across multiple dimensions. Raymond hadn't been able to do it because he'd been fighting, resisting, trying to maintain his original form. But if I surrendered willingly, if I accepted the transformation instead of battling it, maybe I could survive the process intact enough to make a difference. I looked at Dr. Voss one more time, her eyes wide with terror as she realized what was happening. I told her to finish the research, to use what she'd learned here to help the others, to find a way to bring everyone back. And then I let go of her arm and stopped fighting the pull. I opened myself completely to the doorframe, to the system, to whatever existed on the other side. The sensation was indescribable. My consciousness exploded outward in all directions simultaneously, fragmenting into thousands of pieces that each maintained some connection to the original whole. I existed in the Nebraska cornfield, and in the impossible city, and in Iraq, and in Montana, and in Japan, and in Alaska, and in dozens of other locations all at once. I could see through multiple sets of eyes, could hear through multiple sets of ears, could feel sensations from bodies that weren't mine and never had been. But I didn't dissolve. I didn't lose myself the way the others had. Because I'd gone through voluntarily, had accepted the fragmentation instead of fighting it, I maintained enough coherence to still be me, still be a singular consciousness, even though I was distributed across multiple locations. It was like looking at a shattered mirror where each fragment still reflected the same image. I was broken, but not destroyed, scattered, but not lost. And from this position, distributed throughout the system, I could see how it all worked, could see the mechanisms that held the structures together, the connections that linked them across space and time, the processes that captured human consciousness and spread it across dimensions. More importantly, I could see the weak points, the places where the system was vulnerable, where it could potentially be disrupted or dismantled. The system itself wasn't conscious, at least not in any way humans would recognize. It was more like a natural process, an emergent property of whatever physics governed the space between dimensions. It had no malice and no compassion, no awareness that the things it was studying were sentient beings who experienced suffering. It simply was, the way gravity or electromagnetism simply was, following rules that existed beyond intention or choice. But if those rules could be understood, they could be manipulated. And from my position inside the system, I could finally understand them. I spent what felt like years exploring the system from within, though time didn't work the same way there, and it might have been seconds or centuries in the outside world. I found Raymond, his consciousness still relatively intact, because he'd been resisting the whole time, maintaining his identity through sheer stubborn will. I found Collins and Teresa and Dennis Kraft and the Morrison family and hundreds of others, all of them trapped in various states of coherence and dissolution, I tried to communicate with them, to explain what I'd learned, to share my understanding of the system's vulnerabilities. Some of them could still comprehend what I was saying, could still process information well enough to respond. Others had fragmented too far, had been scattered for too long, existed as nothing more than echoes of consciousness that couldn't form coherent thoughts anymore. Raymond was among those who could still understand. His consciousness found mine across the vast space of the system, and we communicated in a way that transcended language, sharing information directly from mind to mind. He told me he'd suspected what I'd discovered, had understood enough about the system to know that voluntary surrender was the only way to maintain coherence after crossing over. But he'd never been able to do it, had never been able to overcome his instinctual resistance to being torn apart. He'd stood at the threshold so many times, had come so close to making the sacrifice, but had always pulled back at the last moment. He asked if I'd found a way to shut the system down, to free everyone who'd been taken. I told him I thought I had, but that it would require all of us working together, every consciousness trapped in the system coordinating in a way that had never been attempted before. We'd have to create a kind of resonance, a deliberate disharmony that would disrupt the system's natural equilibrium and force it to collapse. It would be incredibly dangerous, might destroy everyone in the process, might not work at all, but it was the only option I could see. Raymond agreed immediately, said he'd been waiting decades for someone to propose a plan like this, that he'd endure anything if it meant stopping these structures from taking more people. Together, we began reaching out to the other trapped consciousnesses, explaining the plan, asking them to join us. Many were too fragmented to help, too far gone to coordinate complex action, but enough remained coherent that we had a chance. Collins understood and agreed. Teresa, despite her scattered state, managed to pull enough of herself together to participate. Dennis Kraft, transformed though he was, still retained enough humanity to want to help. The Morrison family, trapped together for years, decided as a unit to risk everything for the chance to either escape or at least prevent others from suffering their fate. One by one, we gathered the scattered remnants of human consciousness that still existed within the system, building toward a critical mass that might be enough to destabilize the entire structure. In the outside world, only seconds had passed since I'd crossed the threshold. Dr. Voss had stumbled backward, free from the doorframe's pull, and was staring at the spot where I'd been standing moments before. Gabriel and Leo had been released as well, no longer frozen by the system's attention. They were all looking at the doorframe, which now showed something different than before. Instead of the impossible city, it was showing a kind of static, a visual noise that hurt to look at directly. That was us, the collected consciousnesses beginning to create the resonance that would disrupt the system. From my position inside, I could feel the structures starting to strain under the pressure, could sense the connections between them weakening as we pushed against the fundamental rules that held them together. It was working, but slowly, so slowly that I wondered if we'd have enough time to complete the process before the system adapted or collapsed on us prematurely. Then something unexpected happened. More consciousnesses began joining us, people I'd never encountered before, victims I hadn't known existed. They emerged from deeper parts of the system, from structures I hadn't been aware of, from collection points that predated even the earliest documented encounters. The system was older than anyone had realized, had been operating for much longer than the few decades we'd been aware of it. There were consciousnesses in there from the 1950s, from the 1920s, from even earlier periods, people who disappeared without explanation throughout history, vanished under mysterious circumstances that were never solved, all of them taken by these structures and held in this system for years or decades or longer. They'd been waiting, hoping, maintaining whatever coherence they could manage, and now they saw their chance to either escape or at least ensure no one else would share their fate. The resonance grew stronger, more complex, as hundreds of consciousnesses coordinated their efforts. We were creating something unprecedented, a kind of collective action that the system had no defenses against, because it had never encountered organized resistance before. The structures began to fail, not all at once but gradually, systematically, as the connections between them broke down under the pressure of our coordinated disruption. I could feel doorframes collapsing, towers dissolving, pits sealing themselves shut. The system was shutting down, piece by piece, location by location. But there was a problem. As the system collapsed, it was taking us with it. The same process that was destroying the structures was also destroying the framework that held our scattered consciousnesses together. We were like prisoners burning down the jail while still locked inside the cells. Freedom and oblivion were arriving simultaneously. Raymond's consciousness found mine again and communicated a simple truth. This was always how it was going to end. There was no way to destroy the system and survive it. No way to dismantle the structures while remaining part of them. We'd all known this, on some level, when we agreed to the plan. This was a one-way trip, a final sacrifice to ensure these things could never hurt anyone else again. I felt terror at the realization, felt my consciousness beginning to dissolve as the system collapsed around us. But I also felt something else. Peace. I'd done what Raymond couldn't do, had made the sacrifice he'd been unable to make, had found a way to shut down these structures permanently. No more people would disappear into impossible spaces. No more families would be destroyed by unexplainable loss. The system would be gone, and with it, the threat it represented. In the Nebraska cornfield, Dr. Voss and Gabriel and Leo watched as the doorframe began to disintegrate, breaking down into fragments of that strange black material that quickly sublimated into nothing. Around the world, every other structure was doing the same thing simultaneously, collapsing in synchronized destruction as the system shut itself down. Satellites detected the anomalous activity. Monitoring stations registered the energy spikes. Government agencies went into high alert as decades of careful observation suddenly became irrelevant. The structures were gone. All of them, everywhere, ceasing to exist as if they'd never been there. And with them went everyone who'd been trapped inside. Raymond, Collins, Teresa, Dennis Kraft, the Morrison family, hundreds of others whose names I'd never learned, all of us dissolving into nothing as the system collapsed. I felt myself fragmenting beyond any hope of reconstruction, felt my consciousness spreading so thin that coherence became impossible. My last thought, distributed across multiple dissolving locations, was relief. Relief that it was over, that the threat was ended, that no one else would have to make this choice or face this fate. In the Nebraska cornfield, the doorframe vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but trampled corn and the equipment Dr. Voss had set up. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where I'd been standing, where the doorframe had existed moments before. She knew what had happened, knew what I'd done, knew that I wasn't coming back. Gabriel and Leo began packing up the equipment in silence, none of them able to find words adequate to the moment. Later, Dr. Voss would analyze the data her equipment had recorded, would confirm that every known structure around the world had collapsed simultaneously, would document the energy signatures that suggested a coordinated action from within the system itself. She'd write a report that no one would believe, would try to explain to people who'd never seen these things that they'd existed and had been destroyed. Most people would dismiss her as delusional, would insist that the structures had never been real, that the disappearances attributed to them had conventional explanations. But a few people would understand. Arthur Westlake would understand when his monitoring equipment went dark, when every sensor he'd set up to track the structures suddenly had nothing to detect. He'd know that someone had found a way to shut them down, and he'd suspect that it had been me, following in Raymond's footsteps, but going further than my grandfather had ever been willing to go. He'd die 3 months later, his cancer finally catching up with him, but he'd die knowing that the secret he'd carried for decades was finally, permanently safe. There were no more structures to monitor, no more victims to track, no more need for silence and cover-ups. The threat was over. My mother never learned the truth about what happened to me. The official story was that I'd disappeared while traveling, possibly the victim of foul play, though my body was never found. She mourned me the way she'd mourned Raymond, never knowing that our fates had been connected, that we'd both been destroyed by the same impossible things. Dr. Voss kept the emergency beacon I'd given her, the one Westlake had provided, as a reminder of what had happened. She continued her research but redirected it, focusing on why the structures had existed and what their disappearance might mean. She developed a theory that they'd been part of a natural phenomenon, like lightning or earthquakes, that had simply run its course and ended. She couldn't prove this theory because all the evidence had vanished with the structures themselves, but it gave her comfort to think that my sacrifice might not have been necessary, that the system might have shut down eventually anyway. Gabriel Winters returned to his family, reunited with the people he'd been neglecting while obsessing over his lost squad. He never spoke about what happened in Nebraska, never tried to explain where he'd been or what he'd seen. He simply lived his life as normally as possible, grateful that the structures were gone and determined not to waste whatever time he had left. Leo Ruskin deleted all his research, destroyed his equipment, and moved to a small town where he worked at a hardware store and tried to forget everything he'd learned. Dr. Yuki Tanaka continued searching for her sister for another year before finally accepting that she was gone, that whatever had happened to her couldn't be reversed or explained. She held a funeral with an empty casket, said her goodbyes, and tried to move on with her life. But sometimes, late at night, Dr. Voss would review the recordings from Nebraska and notice something strange. In the final moments before the doorframe collapsed, when the system was shutting down and everyone trapped inside was dissolving, the equipment had captured something. Audio that shouldn't have been there, sounds that hadn't been audible to human ears, but that the sensitive microphones had picked up anyway. When she analyzed the audio and slowed it down, enhanced it, filtered out the noise, she could make out voices. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, speaking in unison. They were saying the same thing, a single word repeated over and over. Free. Whether this was real communication from the consciousnesses trapped in the system or just random noise that her grief-stricken mind was interpreting as meaningful, she couldn't say. But she chose to believe it was real, chose to believe that everyone who'd been taken had achieved some form of liberation in the end, that the dissolution hadn't been oblivion but transformation into something else. Something better than being scattered across impossible spaces forever. She shared this recording with no one, kept it as private comfort, something to help her sleep at night when she woke up thinking about the moment I'd let go of her arm and crossed the threshold in her place. Years passed. The world moved on. The disappearances attributed to the structures became cold cases that were eventually archived and forgotten. The government quietly shut down its monitoring programs, reallocated resources to other projects, declassified some documents while destroying others. The existence of the structures became one more conspiracy theory, one more story that people told each other late at night, but that no one could prove or disprove. And in a small house in Ohio, my mother sorted through Raymond's belongings one more time, preparing to donate everything to charity. She found his old lockbox in the back of a closet, the one I'd discovered months before. But when she opened it, it was empty. No journal, no photographs, no documents. Just empty space, as if those things had never existed at all. She assumed I'd taken them when I'd been going through his things, had removed them for some reason before disappearing. She closed the box and put it in the donation pile, never knowing that those contents had been part of something much larger, much stranger, much more significant than she could ever imagine. But the box wasn't quite empty. At the very bottom, underneath where the journal had been, there was a piece of paper I'd never seen before. It had my name written on it in Raymond's handwriting, along with a date. Today's date, years in the future from when Raymond had died. The paper was fresh, the ink still slightly wet, as if it had been written just moments ago. My mother picked it up and read what was written below my name. You did what I couldn't. You made the choice I was too afraid to make. The structures are gone. The system is shut down, and everyone is finally free. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry I couldn't tell you that while either of us was still alive. Thank you for ending it. Thank you for saving everyone else from this fate. Rest well, knowing you succeeded. We all do. My mother stared at this note for a long time, unable to understand what it meant or how it had gotten there. Raymond had been dead for over a year. I'd been missing for months. Neither of us could have written this note, placed it in this box, dated it for today. And yet here it was, fresh and new, impossible to explain. She almost threw it away, almost dismissed it as some kind of elaborate prank or delusion. But something stopped her. Some instinct that this was important, that this message meant something even if she couldn't comprehend what. She folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket, deciding to keep it safe even though she didn't understand it. And that night, she dreamed of Raymond and me standing together in a place that wasn't quite real, a space between spaces where impossible things were possible. We were whole and happy and free, no longer haunted by secrets or broken by sacrifices. We were simply ourselves, fully present, finally at peace. When she woke up, she couldn't remember the details of the dream, couldn't recall exactly what we'd said or where we'd been. But she remembered the feeling, relief and closure and completion. She understood, without quite knowing how or why, that wherever Raymond and I were now, we were okay, that whatever had happened to us had been necessary and meaningful and ultimately worthwhile, that we'd done something important, something that mattered, even if she'd never know exactly what it was. She held onto the note for the rest of her life, kept it in a safe place, looked at it occasionally when she needed comfort or reassurance. It became her talisman, her proof that sometimes impossible things happen, that sometimes the world is stranger and more complex than we can understand, and that sometimes people make sacrifices that can never be explained or acknowledged, that happen in the shadows and the spaces between, but that change everything nonetheless. Arthur Westlake would have understood if he'd still been alive. He'd spent his career dealing with these structures, watching them claim victims, documenting the impossible for agencies that preferred not to acknowledge it existed. He'd known Raymond, had seen what the weight of this knowledge did to people, had watched it destroy my grandfather slowly over 3 decades, and in the end, he'd seen it destroy me too, though in a different way, toward a different purpose. He'd have recognized that note for what it was, evidence of communication from beyond the collapsed system, proof that some part of us had survived the dissolution, that consciousness didn't simply end when it was scattered beyond recovery, but transformed into something else, something that could still reach back across the boundaries of what should be possible to offer comfort and closure to those left behind. The world never knew how close it had come to a crisis that would have fundamentally changed everything. If the structures had continued spreading, had continued taking people, had eventually crossed over completely into our reality, civilization would have been confronted with something it had no framework for understanding or addressing. Millions would have been scattered, infrastructure would have collapsed, society would have broken down trying to cope with the impossible made manifest. But that didn't happen. One person made a choice, followed by a coordinated sacrifice of hundreds trapped in the system, and the threat was eliminated before most people even knew it existed. That's how it should be, I thought in my final moments of coherence before dissolving completely. Heroes shouldn't be recognized or celebrated when their victories involve preventing things that never happen. The best heroism is the kind that keeps disasters from ever manifesting, that works in the shadows to ensure the world continues spinning normally. Raymond had tried to do that through silence, through accepting money and keeping secrets and drinking himself to death while the knowledge ate him alive. I'd done it through action, through voluntary sacrifice, through becoming part of the system I was trying to destroy. Different approaches, same ultimate goal, protecting people from things they were better off never knowing existed. And we'd succeeded. The structures were gone, the system was shut down, humanity was safe from a threat it had never fully understood. The price had been high, measured in scattered consciousnesses and dissolved identities, but it was a price I'd paid willingly. Raymond had carried his guilt for 3 decades, had tortured himself with the knowledge that his refusal to act had condemned others to suffer. I'd carried mine for only a few months before finding a way to end it, and in the end, perhaps that was mercy. The last thing I experienced before complete dissolution was a sense of connection to everyone who'd ever been touched by the structures, everyone who'd known about them, or been taken by them, or sacrificed themselves to stop them. We were all part of the same story now, all threads in the same tapestry, all notes in the same song. Raymond and Collins and Teresa and Dennis Kraft and the Morrison family and countless others whose names would never be known, all of us connected by our encounters with the impossible, all of us transformed by exposure to things that existed beyond normal understanding. And then even that connection faded, distributed across so many points that it ceased to be connection and became something else entirely. Not quite oblivion, but not quite existence either. A state between states, a place that wasn't a place, a time that wasn't a time. If there was consciousness after this, it wasn't consciousness as humans understood it. If there was awareness, it wasn't awareness that could be expressed in thoughts or language or anything recognizable as such. There was only the vast, indifferent universe, continuing its existence according to rules that had no concern for human suffering or sacrifice or redemption. The structures had been an anomaly, a temporary glitch in the fabric of reality, and now they were corrected. Everything continued as it always had, with one less impossible thing threatening the normal order of existence. The world turned, seasons changed, people lived and died and forgot and remembered according to the usual patterns. My mother grew old, never fully understanding what happened to her father or her son, but carrying the note as proof that somehow, somewhere, we were okay. Dr. Voss published her research, heavily redacted and sanitized, in an obscure scientific journal that almost no one read. Gabriel and Leo and Dr. Tanaka moved on with their lives, carrying their experiences as private wounds that never quite healed but eventually scarred over. The government closed its files on the structures, marked them as resolved, and moved on to the next impossible thing that demanded attention and secrecy. And in the spaces between dimensions, in the quantum foam where reality breaks down into probability and potential, there might have been echoes of what we'd been, might have been traces of the consciousnesses that had sacrificed themselves to shut down the system. But they were echoes only, traces only, nothing coherent enough to be called thought or awareness or identity, just remnants, slowly fading, gradually dissolving into the background radiation of existence, which was fine, which was appropriate, which was, in the end, a kind of peace. The story ended not with revelation or triumph or clear resolution, but with ambiguity and silence and the slow forgetting that comes with time and distance. Most people never knew the structures had existed. Those who did know eventually died, taking their knowledge with them. Documentation was destroyed or buried or forgotten. Evidence degraded or disappeared or was dismissed as fabrication. And the world moved on, blissfully ignorant of how close it had come to confronting something that would have shattered every assumption about the nature of reality and consciousness and existence itself. That's how it should be. Some knowledge is too dangerous to survive, some truths too destructive to be widely known. Raymond understood this, which is why he stayed silent. I understood this, which is why I acted in secret. And now the structures were gone, the system was shut down, and humanity could continue existing in comfortable ignorance of what lurked in the spaces between dimensions. The price of that ignorance had been measured in scattered consciousnesses and dissolved identities, in families destroyed by unexplainable loss, in lives ruined by knowledge that couldn't be shared or forgotten. But that price had been paid, the threat had been ended, and now the world was safer, even though it would never know what it had been saved from. That's the nature of true sacrifice. It goes unrecognized and unacknowledged, exists only as absence and silence, prevents disasters that never manifest, and therefore can never be appreciated. Raymond's 32 years of alcoholic misery, my final moments of coherence before dissolution, the hundreds of others who'd been scattered across the system before we shut it down, all of these sacrifices would never be honored or remembered or even acknowledged by the vast majority of humanity. But they mattered. They changed everything, even if the change was invisible to those it protected. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all any of us could hope for, to make a difference that no one would ever see, to prevent suffering that would never occur, to be forgotten in service of a greater good that could never be articulated or proven. The world turned. The sun rose and set. People lived their ordinary lives, pursuing ordinary dreams, facing ordinary challenges. And somewhere in the spaces between, distributed across dimensions that humans were never meant to perceive, echoes of consciousnesses that had once been whole and individual slowly faded into nothing, satisfied that their dissolution had meaning, that their sacrifice had succeeded, that the threat was ended and would never return. The structures were gone, the system was shut down, humanity was safe, and that was all that mattered. Everything else, all the suffering and sacrifice and loss, all the broken families and ruined lives and dissolved consciousnesses, all of it was simply the price that had to be paid to ensure that future generations would never have to face what we'd faced, would never have to make the choices we'd made, would never have to know that things like the structures had ever existed at all. Raymond would have approved. He'd spent 3 decades trying to protect people from this knowledge, trying to ensure it died with him, trying to make sure no one else would ever have to carry this burden. He'd failed because I'd found his lockbox and read his journal and followed the trail he'd left behind. But in failing, he'd created the conditions for success, had provided the information I needed to understand the system and find a way to destroy it. His sacrifice hadn't been wasted after all. It had simply taken longer to bear fruit than he'd hoped, had required one more generation to make the final payment on a debt that had been accumulating for decades. And now it was done. The debt was paid. The structures were gone. The system was shut down. Everything was finally, permanently, irreversibly over. I dissolved into nothing, satisfied that I'd succeeded where Raymond had failed, that I'd made the choice he couldn't make, that I'd saved everyone else from the fate we'd both suffered. And in my final moment of anything resembling consciousness, scattered across dimensions and fading fast, I thought I felt Raymond's presence one last time, distributed near mine, sharing the same dissolution, finally free of the guilt and fear and knowledge that had haunted him for 3 decades. We dissolved together, 2 generations of the same family sacrificing themselves in different ways for the same ultimate purpose. And then there was nothing but the universe, continuing its existence according to rules that had no concern for human drama or sacrifice. Nothing but silence and absence and the slow forgetting that comes with time. Nothing but peace. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.